Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. Hello, and welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines. I'm here with Ben Sanders, CEO and co-founder of Hyper. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, John. Great to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. We're going to dive into your history and experience, learning communication skills and using communication skills in your professional life. But before we start, I'd love to give you an opportunity just to sort of introduce your professional profile. What do you do? What's Hyper? And what's your role in the company like on a day-to-day basis?
If I think about my career life, there's three kind of jobs that I always wanted. The first one was I wanted to be an astronaut. And so I chased that dream pretty hard for a while. Helped NASA get the shuttle back in space, flew on the Vomit Comet. My ring's been on the space station for 6 months. So I was really in that world for a good chunk of time. And then for a period of my life, I wanted to be in government. And I ran for MP in the Yukon, worked in Parliament, worked on a dozen election campaigns. And so, trying to involve and shape policy has been a big part of my life too. And then for the last decade or so, I've been a tech entrepreneur. And I'm currently building my fourth. So my first startup went public. My second became a unicorn, and the third built and sold. And now I'm building Hyper, which is building voice AI that can automate phone calls. And we're specifically helping with government 911. So the big problem that most people don't realize is that if you call 911 in Toronto, a third of the time you have to wait 2 minutes for someone to answer the phone. And that's because their team's super understaffed, and 40% of the call volume shouldn't actually be going to 911. So they're going to punt the non-emergency call volume over to us, and we're going to field that with AI, which will help reduce the wait time for real emergencies, and it's going to save lives.
Well, that sounds like a tremendous service and an exciting space to be in, to say nothing of the richness of that three-stage journey that you just described for us. And I'm really excited to dive into all of it, and in particular hear how you've used communication skills in each of those domains. Before we get there, I'd love if you could travel back in time with us just a little bit and paint a picture for us. What was your early experience with communication skills in schools like? Did you enjoy it? Did it click for you? Was it something that didn't sort of click right away?
I had a unique experience in that I grew up in kind of the sound studio that you're in today. My mom was a radio host on CBC for 38 years. And so I can remember some of my earliest childhood memories in the studio, in the sound booth, with her, watching her splice together reel-to-reel tape, super analog. I think from the earliest days, that gave me a really fond appreciation for voice and radio in particular as a powerful medium. But the importance of communication was kind of instilled in me from the earliest days because of her. And so I can remember, some teachers at school that also, shaped some of that. There's a teacher that I had in grade 7 who gave us kind of 10 rules. I forget exactly what they were, but, when writing, to never kind of start, 2 sentences with the same word, or to not repeat words, and a number of things like that. But my mom was really the driving force for communication, both written, because she was a really tough and helpful editor, and always pushed me to be better, even on those essays when I was up at 11 and I should have been in bed, and wanted to just say it was good enough. She'd always help me find another way to make it a little bit better. And I think that was super helpful. But she also encouraged me, and my principal encouraged me to get into speech competitions, which was something that was helpful too. I was in French immersion, and that was a really effective way to kind of hone that communication skill, which has been pretty invaluable for much of my life.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you, with that exposure to applied communications in a professional environment, my assumption was that you might have found the sort of school applications of those skills to be maybe a little bit limited or sort of inauthentic, knowing that there are sort of public audiences out there and that people are communicating to them, that you would have seen that. So to go out beyond the sort of domain of the classroom and find those sort of extracurricular activities to apply those skills and that interest makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah,
guess.
probably one other strong influence there is in grade 11 and 12, I had a theater teacher. So when a lot of my other friends were kind of, you had the option to kind of take, you know, boring French, which was just kind of grammar all day, or you could apply it in kind of the world of theater and improv, and that was, I think, a really much more interesting way to develop a command of a second language, and there was something theatrical and presentation oriented in it, which I think has also really helped. So yeah, just picking up on that point and double clicking on the idea that, anytime, even if school was something that gave me some of the foundation, if there was an opportunity to leverage that outside in extracurricular manners, I think that's really where it was fun.
I think there's some two really valuable insights there. One for teachers and those who develop curriculum in communications courses, that now more than ever, it's incumbent upon us to provide students with projects and assignments that feel authentic, that allow students to engage in communication with people more outside of just their teacher, right? And to try to make that feel like they're doing something quote unquote real. And then also I think a real insight from your experience for people who are in school today to seek out those extracurricular opportunities, whether it's debate or Model United Nations or theater or the arts. And now more than ever, there are digital platforms that allow people to really engage in media production in a sophisticated way. Do you think back in the day, if you had TikTok at your disposal, you would have been putting yourself out there in the world with your own homemade videos of DIY space projects?
I haven't always kind of chased the limelight in that way, and I'm not one to broadcast a whole lot on socials today. So I'm not sure that a more video-oriented platform may have changed things for me necessarily. But I certainly recognize that it's a big impact for kids today. Model Parliament, you touched on it though. That was like a really great experience, right? Kind of combining interests in politics and theater, improv. When I think about the things that did really help me from school, aside from all the content that you learn, like typing was actually pretty helpful to effectively use an inefficient QWERTY, keyboard. Um, Theater and kind of speech competitions and some of those things, developing the confidence to kind of speak in front of an audience has been super helpful too. And then actually learning a second language was very helpful too, in many ways that I wouldn't have imagined it to be.
Maybe we can jump in there. Tell me more about that. How do you find that second language to be useful in your professional life?
Well, the first job I ever got was probably the coolest office I'd ever had in my life, and that was working in Ottawa in the House of Commons as a page. I used to bring water to the Prime Minister every day, and pass around physical notes, because at that time they didn't have, mobile devices. Ironically, I left and went to Waterloo and worked at BlackBerry, which was maybe putting the pages out of business. But that was a really cool experience, and something that wouldn't have been possible without kind of a command of both English and French. If I look to later days running for MP, being able to speak French was helpful there. I built my last startup entirely in government. And so again, having a command of both languages there has been really helpful. And as a dad now, and I think about introducing that language even earlier for my son than I had it. I think it helped me fundamentally kind of reinforce some of the principles in my first language. A lot of parents sometimes ask me like, "Hey, is my kid going to struggle in English because they're spending time learning French?" And I think for me, it actually made both stronger and richer to have them in complement. So, you know, I'd encourage anyone to try and seek that opportunity out, especially early on, because my partner is a doctor, and I was amazed to learn this recently. But when you learn a second language kind of before you're 5, it develops in a different part of your brain, right? And if you learn that same language later, it's in a kind of a different part of your brain that's less effective or less equipped
Right. Yeah.
to use it, right? And so, um, yeah.
And obviously French has such an important and embedded role in Canadian business and political and social life, but an interconnected world now more than ever. There are so many languages that could be useful in a professional context, I'm sure. I loved how you were talking about that sort of hybridity being an advantage to you, and I think that's an opportunity for us to um, dive into your first career in engineering and space and the sciences. If I had just heard your profile from your early days and the things that you told me that you were into, I might have imagined you heading in a trajectory towards politics or law or something in the humanities, and yet you started in the sciences. And I'm really curious to hear about what that journey was like, and how you continue to use those communication skills. Were they unique in your field? Did you find that they gave you an advantage? Did you find that you were able to do things that maybe you might not otherwise have been able to do if you didn't already have that really rich skill set?
So I can remember feeling really torn in first year university because I'd moved to Ottawa, living away from home for the first time, and I had this really cool job working as a page in the House of Commons. But ultimately, the pace of government felt really slow, and I was young and naive, and I wanted to kind of, have more of an impact faster. I was really excited to jump in and not just kind of be on the sidelines, and exploring kind of what that meant for me. I can remember there was a prof in university who I was part of some like 101 essay writing kind of class. I think you taught something like that, right? And I remember the prof writing something on the side saying like, "Hey, if you're not considering like a path in writing or in kind of communications or arts, like it might be a mistake." And in the back of my head, I was thinking, well, I don't know if this politics thing is for me, um, and I'd always been, really strong with math and sciences in school, and so it made me think back to high school when we had this opportunity to kind of job shadow. Most of my friends went with their mom or dad's colleague to work for the day. I, again, because my mom had really encouraged me to believe that anything was possible, you just had to kind of try. I remember writing to the prime minister and Bill Gates and a number of kind of inspiring figures to me at the time. And one of them was Marc Garneau, Canada's first astronaut. At the time, he was the president of the space agency. And he wrote back because I was living in Winnipeg, and he said, "Hey, yeah, I'm not often in Winnipeg, but if you're ever in Ottawa or Montreal, look me up." And so halfway through my page year, when I was kind of looking for maybe, what's next, I looked him up, and he invited me in for lunch in Ottawa. And I remember vividly that encounter because I asked him, "Hey, how did you become an astronaut? Like, what would it take?" And he looked at me and said, "Ben, I'm sorry to say the odds are impossibly tough, right? Like Canada had picked 6 astronauts, and then 9 years later we picked four, and then 18 years after that only picked two. So the numbers were really getting tough." But he said, "Here are 10 things that you can do that will enrich your candidacy, and even if you don't get picked, they'll kind of lead to a better life." And I thought, hey, that's kind of a neat way to live by. And after that meeting, I scribbled down 10 things on a piece of paper, and I carried that in my wallet for 5 years. And one of them was get an advanced kind of engineering or sciences or medicine degree, right? So I switched into Waterloo. I took electrical just because that's what he'd done. And that second year of university after leaving Ottawa, I thought that I'd made a big mistake because I left this kind of really cool environment of, by fellow pages who were all kind of leaders and kind of big thought kind of idealists around the world, and I was suddenly kind of thrown back into dorm school, and yet that experience proved to be hugely valuable in my development. Um, for many reasons, but because the co-op program there is really strong, I got some great work experience. And that work experience, more than academically, I think exposed me again to applied kind of communication in some interesting ways, both in the kind of reports we had to write, but also in the real life kind of communication I was doing on the job, which is fundamentally different from kind of writing essays in class and that type of thing, right? And so that was hugely valuable for me. And some of the work that I did with the space agency was that I would go in and present and engage classrooms when the astronauts were too busy, And so I continued to develop some of that public speaking opportunity. And it's a big part of why I wanted to be an astronaut, is I felt I could really help in a big way in that regard. So another thread of kind of communication within that dream.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I imagine very interesting to students who might be listening here at Conestoga who are in our electrical engineering technician technologist programs. We have many that would overlap with with your early education, and we also have many opportunities for co-op education. And so I think that they would be very interested to hear how you used your communication skills in that applied environment. You mentioned report writing, and so that seems like a pretty direct application of writing skills. Do you remember there being any sort of bumps along the road when you were given that sort of first assignment to produce a report? Anything where you realize, oh, this is different than what I was being presented with in school, or did you discover that there was an expectation that you weren't hitting yet? What can our electrical engineering students, expect when they get into the workforce, and maybe they discover there's more than just the engineering components?
Yeah, the to be honest with you, the kind of more technical writing was something that was a little less exciting to me. But where I was able to kind of find an interesting connection point for that work is I started writing op-eds in the newspaper. And so that was, for me, a more interesting way to try and distill ultimately my thoughts or ideas or attempts to persuade in a really tight amount of prose that was intended for a different audience, and often a bigger audience, and so that format was something that was just like a lot more interesting to me ultimately.
So this is an area that I'm often speaking to my students about an application that I think is particularly relevant for people who are in IT or engineering or the sciences, that there's likely going to be great value in being able to translate your expert knowledge and understanding of this field and its intricacies to an audience who is not trained in that subject. That to be able to capture the essence of that and explain it in a way that is informative for an audience who is perhaps confused but wants to know, that seems like it's tremendously valuable. Is that something that you found yourself doing either within the company or outside the company with sort of a public facing approach?
Today I use communication in so many ways as a startup leader, as a CEO. It is probably the most important skill for the work that I do today. I just spent the last month recording fundraising. And so I had to meet with over 100 investors and try to convince them and persuade them that what we're doing is worth investing money in. And that's really challenging. I've had to hire teammates and to communicate and persuade them that what we're doing here is important too. These are really applied versions ultimately
Absolutely.
of the op-eds, and I would say that the ability to reach out with cold emails is a particular skill that I have honed in over the years that dates back to when my mom encouraged me to reach out to, the prime minister and those type of um, I think that's like a really lost form of art in some sense that's really hard to master, but it's been super helpful for me. And I would say that at the end of the day, building a startup is kind of creating something from nothing, and you're continually um, kind of communicating a dream that you want to materialize in the world, whether that's with customers buying in or employees or investors, whomever. So it's constantly this evolution of kind of communicating what you want to become, to kind of conjure something out of nothing. And I think that would be impossible, even if you had all the tech skills, if you had even all the money, if you couldn't ultimately communicate these ideas to people, then you know you'd struggle to get any ideas off the ground.
I'm really glad that you've brought up your sort of current role as a tech entrepreneur who's been through the cycle of starting up a company and then building it and having done that several times over. Because in addition to our engineering programs, we also have at the college a growing interest in from students who are looking to make that their career path, and we have some programs that are doing really interesting work to support their growth as entrepreneurs, and so it's a great avenue for us to explore next. And in particular, I'm interested to know from your experience as somebody who's in the AI space, how you feel about the sort of art of writing an email. You just talked now about how sort of fundamental this sort of cold call email, just reaching out to somebody and introducing yourself in an email and saying, this is who I am and this is what we're doing, and let's see if we can start a relationship from there. And yet I know that artificial intelligence, generative AI, is often being promoted to people as a tool to help people do that very thing. How do you juggle that? How do you juggle the use of generative AI in your communications with your desire to engage people in a way that is authentically your own voice?
It's such an exciting time to be playing in this field. When I think back to those engineering days, I loved computer programming because it was a different form of very deterministic kind of communication. You didn't write things in right, wouldn't get the output you wanted on the other end. What's fascinating about AI today is it's a little bit fuzzier. There's a little bit more of a black box. It's a little bit more kind of magical in that you can't control a large language model, kind of the fundamentals behind the ChatGPT, with that same kind of precision or outcome. And yet, in its essence, ultimately, what it is kind of the accumulation of all sorts of written and other kind of communication, distilled into essentially a prediction machine. And so, as much as we think of AI as magic, it is kind of creating an output based on, millions of other sentences it's seen, right? And so it is really just kind of relying on what we have kind of created in the past to kind of figure out what to do next. And what's neat about this is I'm building technology with my team today that can talk to you on the phone. It can even use my voice, but I'm not there, right? And so in order to kind of tee it up effectively, we have to be really effective at communicating with it about the way that we want it to drive that conversation when we're not there. And that's kind of uncovered this whole new kind of career path, something called prompt engineering, which is the art ultimately of really figuring out how to deliver a communication or an instruction super efficiently and effectively to an AI for it to kind of go and do its task. And that's fundamentally done through today through written communication in a very kind of interesting, specific manner. And so if I think about everything I've learned through life to be really good at writing, I can't imagine a scenario where that has been more important than kind of the technology that we're building today. So it's a really exciting time for people at Conestoga who are in kind of engineering, to also recognize that that communication class that maybe you have to take or you didn't really think was important is, I would say, just as critical as kind of the programming that you're doing, because today that is the programming language effectively.
Right. That's a really interesting way of putting it. We're seeing a kind of marriage of two formerly oppositional languages. Right. There was the language of computer code, and there was the language of human interaction, and they were separate from one another. And now they're merging and being used together. It's great, I think, to hear you say that you actually draw on the years of experience and practice and skill developments in order to communicate with and harness effectively the generative AI's sort of best use case, and to have it be as valuable as it can. So because I can understand how it would be hard. It's kind of a contradiction, right? That here's this tool that can seemingly produce very high level written content. It might be, I think, an understandable conclusion to say, well, then that means I don't need to develop those skills. And yet to say, actually, I need very advanced reading and writing and critical thinking skills in order to ask the right questions and to ask follow-up questions and to steer this tool towards the output I want. So to ask a much more sort of practical question, is it fair to assume that you're working with generative AI throughout your sort of daily, business working life as a CEO of a company, as somebody who's looking to build a startup, all the things that go on in the course of your day? Generative AI is part of your sort of toolkit now?
I think it is, and I think it is the new norm for many of us, even if we don't explicitly know it. It is a transformative technology, as big, if not bigger, than kind of the internet and the kind of mobile computing. And so we're going to see it show up in all sorts of parts of our lives, whether we want it or not, right? And so I think the key for kind of preparing oneself for, educationally, for that future is to kind of, you know, accept that reality, kind of like lean into it, right? And figure out how to be effective with it. I think what it's going to do is it's going to make us value authenticity and original content even more, because pretty soon, if it's not happening already, every email you get is actually going to be AI generated. The phone calls you start to get as well, right? We have effectively the technology that would allow the prime minister to call every voter and have a 20-minute conversation personally with them in his voice, right? And if you think about the implications of something like that, even for kind of direct democracy, I mean, the reason we have kind of one MP that rolls up to 100,000 people is just it's hard to be able to do that, but that's
Yeah.
possible now. And how does that change the way that we engage with the world? I could effectively train an AI to be me when I pass, so that Theo can still talk to me when I'm gone, right? That's an incredible kind of outcome too. And so there's going to be some transformative kind of changes. I think we're just at the start of it, but absolutely, it's a big part of everything that I do, in part because we're fundamentally kind of on the leading edge of building some of this technology, and so we have to be immersed in it.
That makes a lot of sense. And yet I think it's so important for young people who are entering the workforce, who feel a kind of comfort and affinity to this new technology as, something that belongs to their generation and something that they're very comfortable using, to also hear you say that there needs to be a really sort of critical and sophisticated and nuanced engagement with this technology, or else you're going to sound like everyone else in the crowd, right? If you're writing that email to a potential funder, I would imagine, tell me if I'm wrong, that one of your biggest sort of objectives is to stand out and to have them get a sense of who you are as distinct from, any of the 20 other emails they might get that day. How do you think how do you approach doing that? Because I think that might be the skill of it, the art of it might not yet be familiar with people who are perhaps willing to treat the generative AI technology as a bit of a magic 8-ball, just sort of shake it up and then take its answer and go.
There's a KW Kitchener-Waterloo company called Vidyard that now allows you to make a digital avatar kind of in video and audio of yourself. And their applications are often for kind of reaching out to customers or reaching out for sales, right? Oh yeah. And so if you think of that, then of that potential already being here, then the notion for kind of the creativity or the authenticity or the original content may not be in creating each communication in a custom way yourself, because actually the technology allows you to do that in a very personalized manner for 1,000 people in the same time. But it will be at a much more foundational piece of how are you programming that to kind of do something that you would have done the same level of focus for one at a greater scale, right, Theo? And Theo's, he's not sure about that feature yet.
That's really interesting, Ben. I think that you've given us a lot of food for thought, and in addition to answering my questions with really rich detail that I think will be helpful for our students who are trying to imagine what their professional lives might look like and how their communications education will play into that. You've also given us some things to think about and questions to take away and mull over, because it is, as you say, an exciting time to be in these spaces. I'm really grateful to you for coming on the podcast today and talking to us about these things, and so glad that we could have Theo make a cameo appearance as well. I hope he feels better.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, and I would encourage any of your audience who's kind of interested to see a taste of kind of AI communication and what's coming next to go to our website, callhyper.com. And there's a phone number there where you can actually call and talk to an AI, and it's kind of an interesting experience. Would love to hear your feedback.
That sounds
if there's
great.
any way we can help you or your students, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm so glad that you're doing this. It's a really fun program.
That's great. Thanks. Maybe offline we'll talk about a possible collaboration with our curriculum. Maybe we can get our students talking to your AI and have them reflecting on what that's like, and do something really interesting there.
A friend of mine who's a prof at the Robbins School, he has created an AI that is effectively a digital version of himself that is better than his TAs, and he's input effectively the video classes from the last 3 years during COVID and all of his written publications and whatnot. And students can now ask him for help at any time and get answers kind of based on real facts that he shared in the past. So even from education, there's some incredible things that are going to change and transform in terms of how we learn. It's an exciting time to be a student, to be learning, and to be involved. So thanks again for the time today. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Ben. Take care. And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.